In this video, we're going to wrap up our study of 2 Samuel chapter 13 through 20. We have looked at these chapters. All of them have to do with the consequences of David's sin with Bathsheba. The civil war started by Absalom and ultimately Absalom's death and David's return to the throne. 2 videos ago, we looked at it and learned the lessons from Joab's role in the story. In the last video, we looked at Absalom and learned lessons from Absalom's role in the story. And now we're going to look at it from David's role and specifically his leadership in his family. And to be quite honest with you, I'm going to be a little bit hard on David in this video because it was his lack of leadership in his family that really caused a lot of trouble in the kingdom. So I'm going to read chapter 13. We're going to go through that slowly, and then I'm going to point out a couple of other things. And then we're going to make application for David's role in this. Now, David is the one that set up the whole thing because of his sin with Bathsheba. And because of that affair, God, through Nathan, told David, one, there's going to be bloodshed in your family, and there's going to be violence in your family because you were violent and killed Uriah. And second, God said, because of your sex with Bathsheba in private, there's actually going to be sexual misconduct in your family that's going to cause great pain and suffering as well. And so we begin in chapter 13. Now David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister named Tamar, and Amnon, her half-brother, fell desperately in love with her. Amnon became so obsessed with Tamar that he became ill. She was a virgin, and Amnon thought he could never have her. So Amnon is David's firstborn son, and he is the heir to the throne when David died. Now, if you know anything about that culture in the Middle East, today really, but especially back then, the oldest son was the favored son. He was the favorite, and Amnon was certainly treated that way by David. But he fell in love with his half-sister Tamar. She and Absalom were actually born from another one of David's wives, and this lineage of the family, Absalom and Tamar, were just beautiful, beautiful people. And so Amnon sees Tamar. She's absolutely beautiful. And the Bible says he, quote, falls in love with her. And is so in love with her, he's ill and thinks that he could never be with her because she is, of course, his half-sister. But Amnon had a very crafty friend, his cousin Jonadab. Now, I want you to remember Jonadab because he plays a huge role in the story. He was the son of David's brother Shemaiah. One day Jonadab said to Amnon, "What's the trouble? Why should the son of a king look so dejected morning after morning?" So Amnon told him, "I am in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." "Well," Jonadab said, "I'll tell you what to do. Go back to bed and pretend you are ill. When your father comes to see you, ask him to let Tamar come and prepare some food for you. Tell him you'll feel better if he prepares it as you watch and feeds you with her own hands." So Amnon lay down and pretended to be sick. And when the king came to see him, Amnon asked him, "Please let my sister Tamar come and cook my favorite dish as I watch. Then I can eat it from her own hands." So David agreed and sent Tamar to Amnon's house to prepare some food for him. Now I want to stop right here and just say this. You understand from Absalom's point of view why he was so mad at David when this sin occurred. Because David, his father, had given Amnon permission to call Tamar in, to cook for him, and to have him feed him with her own hands. And so it's a little fishy. I'm not saying David knew that the rape was going to occur, but David was a very permissive parent, and it caused great pain and suffering in his household because he wouldn't lead his household. He was too permissive. And this is an example right here, and trust me, you will continue to see this throughout. So when Tamar arrived at Amnon's house, she went to the place where he was lying down so he could watch her mix some dough. Then she baked his favorite dish for him. But when she set the serving tray before him, he refused to eat. "Everyone get out of here," Amnon told his servants. So they all left. Then he said to Tamar, "Now bring the food into my bedroom and feed it to me here." So Tamar took his favorite dish to him. But as she was feeding him, he grabbed her and demanded, "Come to bed with me my darling sister. So he now has her in his bedroom by himself. No one is there, and he's grabbed her and said, I want to go to bed with you. No, my brother, she cried, don't be foolish. Don't do this to me. Such wicked things aren't done in Israel. I find that to be a very interesting phrase. Where would I go in my shame? And you would be called one of the great fools in Israel. Please just let me talk to the king about it, and he will let you marry me. So she is trying to now try to get him to keep from raping her. She's saying, hey, what if you just go to the king, and maybe the king would okay it, and maybe we can get married. So she's really trying to work her way out of getting raped here, but Amnon would have none of it. And so it says, but Amnon wouldn't listen to her, and since he was stronger than she was, he raped her. Then suddenly Amnon's love turned to hate, and he hated her even more than he had loved her. Get out of here, he snarled at her. That is so interesting to me, because I know so many people who are caught up in lust, and they think they're in love when they're in lust. And then once the sin is over, that lust turns to absolute regret and shame and bitterness and hatred. I've seen this happen so many times. We're so in love until it happens, and then we hate each other. Boy, that is so true psychologically of what happens in sin, especially it seems like in the area of sexual sin. So I find that to be very fascinating and psychologically accurate as to what happens. No, no, Tamar cried, sending me away now is worse than what you've already done to me. But Amnon wouldn't listen to her. He shouted for his servant and demanded, throw this woman out and lock the door behind her. And of course, in that culture, Tamar could have been stoned, or she could just be left in her life in shame, and that's exactly what happened here. If she would have gone to a trial, she would have been stoned for being an adulteress. That's the way they happened in that culture. You just assumed you were a virgin till you got married. But because she was a daughter of the king and no one, quote, brought it before the legal system, she just lived her life in shame. And so it says here, so the servant put her out and locked the door behind her. She was wearing a long, beautiful robe, as was the custom in those days for the king's virgin daughters. But now Tamar tore her robe and put ashes on her head, and then with her face in her hands she went away crying. Her brother Absalom saw her and asked, is it true that Amnon has been with you? Well, my sister, keep quiet for now. See, he doesn't want her to bring it out and go to trial. He says, since he is your brother, don't worry about it. So Tamar lived as a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's house, and really did that for the rest of her life. Now here's where I want to focus on David. Verse 21, when David heard what had happened, he was very angry. And some of the Bibles also add, but he did not punish his son Amnon because he loved him, for he was his firstborn. And though Absalom never spoke to Amnon about this, he hated Amnon deeply because of what he had done to his sister. Now, I want you to think about David's role in this story. David is a father. He is the father of that little girl that got raped. But because Amnon was his favorite and he was heir to the throne, although David was very angry about what he did, he never dealt with Amnon. He never disciplined him. Of course, Amnon should be killed. He should be killed under that law. He should be killed. And David didn't do anything about it. Don't you know that burned Absalom up? Don't you know that burned the other siblings up? Don't you know that that made the girl siblings in that family feel insecure and unsafe with David as their father? This is such a tragedy of leadership in the family by David. He just refused to deal with his kids. He refused to protect his kids. He refused to discipline his kids. He let his kids run all over him, and Amnon got away with rape, and David allowed it. Just a tragedy in leadership here by David. So let's read on. 2 years later, okay, so it's now been 2 years since the rape. 2 years, Absalom has been sitting on this bitterness and on this knowledge. Absalom's sheep were being sheared at Bel Hazor near Ephraim. Absalom invited all the king's sons to come to a feast. And so he's throwing a feast for all the king's sons. He went to the king and said, my sheep shearers are now at work. Would the king and his servants please come to celebrate this occasion with me? The king replied, no, my son, if we all came, we would be too much of a burden on you. Absalom pressed him, but the king would not come, though he gave Absalom his blessing. So Absalom has his blessing for this party. Well, then Absalom said, if you can't come, how about sending my brother Amnon with us? Why Amnon, the king asked, but Absalom kept on pressing the king until he finally agreed to let all his sons attend, including Amnon. So Absalom prepared a feast fit for a king. Absalom told his men, wait until Amnon gets drunk, then at my signal kill him. Don't be afraid, I'm the one who has given the command. Take charge and do it. So as Absalom's signal, they murdered Amnon, and the other sons of the king jumped on their mules and fled. As they were on their way back to Jerusalem, the report reached David, Absalom has killed all the king's sons, and no one is left alive. The king got up, tore his robe, and threw himself on the ground. His advisors also tore their robes in horror. Now, I want you to think about this again from the standpoint of David's leadership. Absalom comes and says, oh, I'm going to throw a party. It's 2 years later. Let me throw this party. Please let me throw this party. I want Amnon there. And David says, why? Why would you want Amnon there? David knows why. David knows what Amnon has done to Tamar. David knows Absalom loves Tamar and is protecting her. He knows Absalom is bitter. If he's paying any attention to what's going on in his home, he knows what's going on. But notice once again, he will not protect his children. He lets Absalom talk him into it. He's a pushover. He won't lead. He won't say no to his kids. And his inability to say no to his kids destroys his family to the point that Absalom murders Amnon right in front of his brothers at a party. So now David is very distraught. But just then Jonadab, remember I told you Jonadab was going to play a big role in this story, the son of David's brother Shemaiah arrived and says, no, don't believe that all the king's sons have been killed. It was only Amnon. Absalom has been plotting this ever since Amnon raped his sister. Listen to what Jonadab says. He says, Absalom has been planning this for 2 years. Now, it's interesting to me that Jonadab knows that, which tells me that Absalom has been planning it and has been communicating his plans around the palace. Don't you know that other people knew? And if Jonadab knew, don't you know that David had some inkling that something was going on? And yet what was David willing to do? Absolutely nothing. And so then from there, Absalom fled to his grandfather, Talmai, the son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur. He stayed there in Geshur for 3 years, and King David, now reconciled to Amnon's death, longed to be reunited with his son Absalom. So 3 years go by. Absalom is living out of the country with his mother's father, and for 3 years, David is mourning Amnon's death, but finally he's done mourning his death, and he longs for his son Absalom. Well, that's where we go into chapter 14, where Joab sees that David is upset. So Joab talks David into bring Absalom back into Jerusalem to be reunited with his father. And so where I want to take this up is in verse 23 of chapter 14. Then Joab went to Geshur and brought Absalom back to Jerusalem. But the king, he's talking about David, gave this order: Absalom may go to his own house, but he must never come into my presence. So Absalom did not see the king. So the king, David, is longing for his son Absalom, but then when Absalom comes home to live in Jerusalem at David's permission, he won't let him see him. There's pride involved in this whole process where David, he wants to see his son Absalom, but he's still angry with him for killing Amnon. He never dealt with Amnon. He never dealt with Absalom. How does he deal with Absalom now? I'm going to ignore you. He doesn't lead. He doesn't try to reconcile the relationship. He doesn't try to bring justice. He doesn't try to discipline. He doesn't even try to communicate. He simply acts as if it doesn't exist and ignores his own son. No leadership in the family. So, let's read on. Now, Absalom was praised as the most handsome man in all Israel. He was flawless from head to foot. He cut his hair only once a year, and then only because it was so heavy. When he weighed it, it was 5 pounds. He had 3 sons and 1 daughter. His daughter's name was Tamar, and she was very beautiful. Absalom lived in Jerusalem for 2 years, but never got to see the king. So for 2 years, David has Absalom living in the same city as him, but he won't reach out to him. He won't talk to him. He won't lead him. He won't communicate with him. Absolute absence of leadership for 2 years by David. complete conflict avoidance, to the point that Absalom finally gets Joab, and through burning up his crops, gets Joab to pay attention to him and says, listen, I've got to see my dad, and if he sees something wrong with me, have him kill me, but I want to see him. And so chapter 14 ends in verse 33. So Joab told the king what Absalom had said. Then at last David summoned Absalom, who came and bowed low before the king, and the king kissed him. So they finally see each other, but it's very formal, it's very stuffy, it's very stiff. There's no conversation, there's no reconciliation. Absalom just bows before him, and David gives him the kingly kiss, but that is all. So then in chapter 15, if you will remember, what happens next is Absalom goes out, and for 4 years, sits at the city gate, and when people come to David for advice, Absalom says, oh, David's not giving advice right now. David's not being a good king. I would be a good king. I would love to be your king. And the Bible says for 4 years, Absalom met people at the city gates and kissed the babies and talked to them about his leadership and won the hearts of the people of Israel away from David. 4 years. Now, we talked about that from Absalom's perspective on the last video, so I'm not going to talk about that story except from David's perspective. My question is, for 4 years, Absalom steals the kingdom right out from under David. Where's David? Where is David? Where's his leadership? You know that for 4 years, if he's doing this, at some point, some advisors have come to David and told him what Absalom has done. You know, after a while, after 6 months or a year or 2 years, when no one's coming to him for advice anymore, he must realize, hey, something's going on in my kingdom. People aren't coming to me anymore. But David does nothing. He doesn't talk to Absalom. He doesn't deal with Absalom. He doesn't lead Absalom. He does nothing. And in fact, psychologists who study this saying he had to be clinically depressed, and he's holed up in his palace doing who knows what. Who knows what he's doing. But I'll tell you what he's not doing. He's not leading his nation, and he's not leading his family. David, there is a vacuum of leadership at this point in his life. From the time of that death of his child as a result of his Bathsheba experience, and that child died, David went into a deep depression and did nothing to lead the kingdom and nothing to lead his people and nothing to lead his family. David was completely null of any leadership at all. So now we know from previous videos and from reading the Bible before what happens. What happens is Absalom starts a rebellion against David, and Absalom wants to kill his father. And so the battle ensues, and when we get to chapter 18, Absalom now comes against battle against David. David is in hiding, and David tells Joab, do not kill my son Absalom. Do not kill him. But Absalom gets his hair hung in the tree. Joab comes and kills him. So we see the end of that. No, you have to understand, when Absalom dies, the threat is over. David gets to return to the throne. He gets to be king again. He gets to live out his years as king of Israel. So the civil war is over. The rebellion is over. It's been quelled, and his life has been saved by Joab. But at the end of chapter 18, verse 33, it says, the king was overcome with emotion. He went up to his room over the gateway and burst into tears. And as he went, he cried, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. Then in chapter 19, here's where I really want you to focus in with me here. This is so important what he says. Word soon reached Joab that the king was weeping and mourning for Absalom. As all the people heard of the king's deep grief for his son, the joy of that day's victory was turned into deep sadness. They crept back into the town that day as though they were ashamed and had been sacrificed or deserted in battle. The king covered his face with his hands and kept on crying, oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son. So I want you to imagine this picture. They have now fought. Many of them died to protect David and get the kingdom back for David. But instead of David saying, thank you very much for saving my life, and if you'll remember, in that culture, when a new king took over, that new king would usually kill the whole family of the old king so there wouldn't be an uprising against him or an assassination. So probably when Absalom took over, he would have killed David, all of his brothers, all of his sisters, all of his relatives, so that they would not get revenge for David and kill him. But yet David, instead of being thankful that his whole family is saved from Absalom, who wanted to kill them, He is mourning Absalom's death and saying, oh, I wish I would have died and not you. Listen to what Joab says. These are some of the wisest words in all of Scripture. In my opinion, the best phrase in this whole book. Listen to this. Then Joab went to the king's room and said to him, we saved your life today, and the lives of your sons and daughters and wives and concubines. Yet you act like this, making us feel ashamed of ourselves. Listen to this. You seem to love those who hate you and hate those who love you. I'm going to talk about that phrase in a moment. You have made it clear today that your commanders and troops mean nothing to you. It seems that if Absalom had lived and all of us had died, you would be pleased. Now, go out there and congratulate your troops, for I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a single one of them will remain here tonight. Then you will be worse off than ever before. And to David's credit, he listened to Joab. He went out, he thanked them, he took back over, restored his kingdom, and was able to live out as king of Israel for the rest of his life. But here's where I want you to focus here. David's inability to lead his family, to the point that his own son is trying to murder him, and his army protected him and saved his life and the life of his family, and instead of thanking his army, he's mourning the son that was trying to murder him. And then listen to what Joab said. You seem to love those who hate you and hate those who love you. I want to spend the rest of our time on this video talking about that phrase. And I want you to think through with me David's failure as a leader and the failure of so many people I see in our culture. Let's say there's a family. It's a husband and a wife and 3 kids. And let's say they have 2 kids that are pretty good and they don't walk in rebellion and they're pretty successful. And then you have one child who is just rebellious and lives an immoral lifestyle and is involved in drugs and alcohol, and they won't get a job. And what will happen so many times is those families will ignore the 2 healthy kids and spend all of their time and money and energy and resources chasing after the child that is dysfunctional, that is their enemy. They're acting as if they love the one that hates them, and yet here's the 2 kids that love them and are good, and they'll ignore them, and they are hating those that love them. And that's what Joab is talking to David about right here. You have all these people who love you and you ignore us, and you have these people who hate you and you love them. What is wrong with you? What is wrong with this picture? And yet, I'm telling you, in our culture, I see it happen all the time. We chase down the dysfunctional member of the family and ignore those who are still healthy. And we spend all of our time and energy and money on the one that is causing us great pain and suffering, and then we slight those who are healthy. We hate those who seem to love us and love those who seem to hate us. Let me give you 2 illustrations and then we'll wrap this up, because this was David's big failure and, in my opinion, our big failure today in leading our families. David's big failure was he couldn't lead his family. He couldn't stand up to his kids. He couldn't discipline his kids. He wouldn't lead. 2 stories. 1, I want you to think of this word picture when you think of this from now on. Everyone in your life that is close to you, your kids certainly, your spouse certainly, potentially maybe a sibling, potentially maybe a parent, or maybe a close friend. You're all tied together emotionally, and I want you to think about it. You're tied together by a rope around your ankle. Okay, so you're walking through life together and you have a rope around your ankle. And so when someone tries to go off, we try to pull them back and we try to pull them back and we try to keep each other together. And of course we love each other and people mess up and we pull them back up. But every once in a while in this circle of yours that is so tight, someone, in spite of how much we love them and in spite of how much we care for them, they decide to self-destruct. They decide to jump off a cliff. And when they jump off a cliff, we have 2 choices as the leader of our family. We can go off the cliff with them and die, or we can cut the rope. And I have seen so many families destroyed because the leader of the family was so weak that when a rebellious person within their family decided to jump off the cliff and self-destruct, they didn't have the guts to stand up and protect the healthy ones, and they wouldn't cut the rope, and the whole family went off the edge. What was David's problem? He wouldn't cut the rope. He wouldn't protect the healthy people in his family. He wouldn't protect Tamar. And then as awful as Amnon was, he didn't protect Amnon. He wouldn't protect the healthy. He wouldn't protect those who loved them. And every time a child decided to jump off the cliff, he would go off with them. As a leader, we have to understand that our family is made up of more people than just the dysfunctional person that wants to jump off the cliff. And sometime we have to let the one who hates us go and cut the rope and protect those who still love us. We have to love those who love us and let the one who hates us go instead of hating those who love us and loving those who hate us. I had a man, I was teaching this last week, and I had a man say, you know what? Exactly this very thing happened to my two sons. He said, I had two sons. One I chased, and you know what? He never came back around. He's still lazy. He still doesn't have a job. He's still blaming me for everything in his life. He said, the other one, I learned my lesson, and I cut the rope, and he fell hard. And he said he came back to me, and he is now preparing to take over my company. Because he said, I dared to cut the rope and made him suffer the consequences of his jumping off the cliff, and it woke him up. Now, that leads me to my second story, and then this video is yours. I really want you to think about this. This is some of the most important stuff I will ever tell you in your life. Do you remember out of Luke chapter 15, the story of the prodigal son? Do you remember what the father did in that story? His son took all the money and left. And he spent all the money on women and wine till he lost all of his money. And then when he lost all of his money, he ended up in a pig pen with no food, and he had to eat the pig slop. And the most important phrase you'll ever know out of that translates into this story is this. When he was eating that pig slop, it says the boy came to his senses and said, surely going back home is better than eating this pig slop. Now, is the father ready to take him back in when he comes home? Absolutely. That's the point of the story. But let me tell you what the father didn't do. The father didn't go off the cliff with him. The father cut the rope and let the boy suffer his consequences, and when his consequences are he's eating pig slop, he came to his senses. The reason a lot of kids in our culture don't come to their senses is our parents won't let them eat the pig slop. If we were telling this parable in today's culture, the father would follow him to the bar and pay the bar tab and would get him and pull him out and sober him up and let him go back the next night, and would keep pulling him out until the son had spent all of the father's money too, because in our culture, the parents jump off the cliff with the kids. Now, this doesn't have to be parents. It can be siblings, it can be friends, it can be parents, but I'm using the children one because that's the one most prevalent in our culture. It's codependency, and it's unbiblical. And the one thing we need to learn from David's leadership failure is we've got to learn to stand up and lead our families. We've got to tell our kids no. We've got to stand up for the right thing. We've got to protect our kids. And sometimes we're protecting our healthy kids from our unhealthy kids, which means we got to let the unhealthy kids go and trust God and pray for their salvation and pray that they come to their senses and come home. But if they don't, our responsibility is to save the others. We can't walk through life hating those who love us and loving those who hate us. So this is a very strong word today, but one of the most powerful stories on poor leadership in a family that you will ever read in your life. And the consequences are what? Death and destruction and turmoil of a family. And that is where your family will end up if you don't stand up and lead. So we've got to stand up and lead our families. We've got to discipline our kids. We've got to protect our kids. We have got to stand up and lead, and we've got to cut the rope when someone decides to self-destruct within our family unit. So I want you to think about this. I want you to pray about this, because this is very, very important, wise advice to those of you who are leading your family. So take it, pray on it, and become the leader that God wants you to be.